My name is Evelyn Evans, and for most of my 67 years, I believed there were only two things a family could never outrun. The first was grief. The second was gossip. Grief came quietly. Gossip arrived with a smile and a casserole. I learned that on a gray November afternoon, 4 days before Thanksgiving, when I walked into Miller's Market to buy cranberries and fresh sage. The place smelled of cinnamon candles and apples that had been sitting in wooden bins a little too long. Everyone knew everyone in Galena, Illinois. We always had. I had barely reached the dairy aisle when the conversation stopped. Not faded. Stopped. That kind of silence has a sound of its own. I pretended not to notice. At my age, pretending can be an act of mercy. Then I heard my niece Melissa whisper, "I heard Aunt Evelyn finally got caught." Another woman answered, so quietly she probably thought I couldn't hear, "They say she forged Grandpa's letter. That's why Carol never got what was hers." Forged. The word settled into my chest like cold iron. I kept walking without turning around. 38 years working as the county archivist had taught me something important. Documents tell the truth eventually. People rarely do. I paid for my groceries, wished the cashier a happy Thanksgiving, and smiled exactly the way I always smiled. Not one person asked if the rumor was true. By the time I reached my car, 3 more people had looked away instead of meeting my eyes. That told me everything. The whisper had already spread farther than I realized. Driving home, I passed the old Methodist church where my husband, Daniel, and I had renewed our vows on our 40th anniversary. He'd been gone 8 years now. A quiet heart attack on a rainy Tuesday morning had ended a marriage that deserved another 20 years. Sometimes I still caught myself reaching for the passenger seat to tell him something. He would have laughed softly and said, "Evie, lies always get tired before the truth does." I wished he were there to say it again. Our house sat on a hill overlooking bare oak trees that rattled in the autumn wind. I'd lived there for 46 years. Every floorboard knew my footsteps. Inside, everything looked exactly as I'd left it. The blue teapot, Daniel's reading chair beside the fireplace, the quilt my grandmother stitched before I was born. Nothing had changed, except everything had. I unpacked the groceries in silence. Then I walked upstairs. At the end of the hallway stood the small cedar cabinet no one in the family had ever paid much attention to. Inside were dozens of carefully labeled boxes. Birth certificates, old photographs, church bulletins, military papers, letters. People assumed that because I'd spent my career preserving county records, I couldn't stop organizing my own family's history. They were right. What they never understood was why. There was one box I hadn't opened in nearly 15 years. It was tied with a faded green ribbon. My hands rested on the lid, but I didn't lift it. Not yet. Instead, I remembered the day my father had placed that box into my hands. "Someday," he'd said, "someone will tell this story wrong." He looked far older than his 72 years that afternoon. "When they do, you'll know what to keep and what you must finally reveal." At the time, I thought he was talking about old photographs. Now I knew better. The phone rang downstairs. Once, twice, 3 times. I almost ignored it. Almost. When I answered, my younger sister Carol didn't even say hello. "Evelyn," she said, her voice strangely calm, "I think we need to talk before Thanksgiving." There was a pause. Then she asked the one question I had hoped never to hear. "Did you really change Daddy's letter?" For a long moment, I couldn't answer. Not because I didn't know the truth. Because I suddenly realized someone else knew just enough of it to become dangerous. And that frightened me far more than the rumor itself. I did not answer Carol's question right away. Silence has a peculiar effect on people. Most rush to fill it. My years in the county archives had taught me otherwise. If you waited long enough, the other person usually revealed far more than they intended. Carol sighed. "So, it's true?" "No," I said quietly, "it isn't." Another silence. but someone has convinced you it is. I've heard the same story from 3 different people today. Who? It doesn't matter. It matters to me. She hesitated. I don't want to make things worse. They already are. I leaned against the kitchen counter and looked through the window at the maple tree Daniel had planted the year we moved into the house. Most of its leaves had already fallen, leaving only a handful of stubborn red ones clinging to the highest branches. Finally, Carol spoke again. Melissa said Ethan heard it from Rebecca. Rebecca, my nephew's wife. She had joined the family only 6 years earlier, but she possessed a remarkable talent for sounding absolutely certain about things she had never witnessed. And where did Rebecca hear it? I asked. I don't know. Of course she didn't. Rumors almost never remembered where they were born. Only where they landed. I'll see everyone on Thursday, I said. Until then, don't argue with anyone. You aren't even angry. I didn't say that. After we hung up, I stood perfectly still for several minutes. Rebecca. That surprised me. Not because she disliked me. We had always been polite enough with one another. What surprised me was the story she had chosen. Out of every secret hidden inside this family, she had wandered dangerously close to the only one that mattered. Not close enough to know the truth, but close enough to awaken it. People often imagine archivists as lonely souls surrounded by dusty shelves. They're only half right. The records themselves aren't lonely. Every marriage license, every deed, every faded census page carries someone's voice. You learn to recognize patterns, missing signatures, different ink, fold marks, dates that refuse to fit together. History leaves fingerprints everywhere. That habit followed me home long after retirement, which is why, before I even made dinner, I walked upstairs again. The cedar cabinet waited exactly where it always had. I untied the green ribbon. Inside lay dozens of neatly arranged envelopes, each labeled in my father's handwriting. Taxes, insurance, military service, mother's recipes. Near the bottom rested a cream-colored envelope with no label at all. Only one sentence, for Evelyn. No date, no explanation, just my name. I stared at it for a long time before carefully returning it to the box unopened, not because I feared what it contained, because I already knew. Some letters don't need to be reread. You remember every word long after the paper begins to yellow. The next morning, the phone rang again. This time, it was my grandson, Noah. He was 23 now, studying architecture in Chicago, though he still called every Wednesday morning on his drive to class. Morning, Grandma. Morning, sweetheart. You okay? I am. You don't sound like yourself. Young people think older women become invisible. The truth is, older women become very good at hiding pain. I'm just getting ready for Thanksgiving. He laughed. You've already baked the pies, haven't you? Yesterday. I knew it. Then his voice became serious. Grandma, yes? I heard something weird. There it was again, another thread. I almost didn't ask. What did you hear? He hesitated long enough for me to know he regretted calling. They're saying Great-Grandpa left 2 letters. I closed my eyes. Not 1 letter. 2. Whoever had started this story had changed it, added details, filled in blanks they couldn't possibly know. That was the moment I understood this wasn't ordinary family gossip anymore. Someone wasn't simply repeating an old lie. Someone was rebuilding the past, piece by piece, using fragments that should never have existed outside one locked cedar box, and only 4 people had ever known that box was there. 4 people. That number stayed with me long after Noah and I ended the call. My father, my husband, Daniel, myself, and one other person. I walked back upstairs not because I needed to see the cedar cabinet again, but because my mind insisted on retracing every step I had taken over the years. Memory works like old wallpaper. Pull at one corner, and an entire room begins to reveal itself. I knelt beside the cabinet and rested my hand against the smooth cedar door. Daniel had built it himself. There, he'd said, wiping sawdust from his hands. Now you'll have a proper place for the things nobody else knows how to keep." He thought he was talking about family papers. He wasn't. He was talking about trust. The first time my father showed me the contents of that cabinet was the summer of 2009. He had already grown thinner than I liked. Cancer had a way of making even proud men look borrowed from themselves. "Evelyn," he said, sitting at the dining room table, "there are records in this family that don't belong in a courthouse." I smiled. "Everything belongs somewhere." "It does." He looked directly into my eyes. "But not everything belongs to everyone." He handed me the cream-colored envelope. "I've carried this for nearly 40 years. I remember laughing softly. "Then why not destroy it?" His answer never left me. "Because one day someone innocent may need it." At the time, I assumed he meant legal protection. I had spent my entire career believing paper existed to settle arguments. I would later discover that paper often created them. Thanksgiving had always been my favorite holiday. No gifts, no performances, just food, stories, and people pretending not to argue until dessert. This year felt different before it even began. By Wednesday afternoon, Melissa stopped replying to my messages. My nephew Ethan canceled his usual visit to help me move tables. Even my cousin Janet, who never missed an excuse to drink my apple cider, suddenly claimed she had a lot to finish at home. People rarely avoid you all at once. Someone had been making phone calls, quiet ones, careful ones, the kind designed to sound concerned rather than cruel. Those were always the most dangerous. Late that evening, my doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone. When I opened the door, I found my neighbor, Martha Collins, holding a loaf of pumpkin bread wrapped in a checkered kitchen towel. Martha had lived across the street for 32 years. She was one of those women who noticed everything without ever appearing nosy. "I baked too much," she announced. "You always do." She smiled. "And you always pretend to believe me." We laughed. For a few minutes, we talked about ordinary things: the weather, her roses, a roof that needed replacing before winter. Then she became unusually quiet. "Evelyn?" "Yes, I almost didn't come." "I know." She looked embarrassed. "I heard what people are saying." "I'm sure you did. I don't believe it." "I appreciate that. But someone wants everyone else too." That sentence settled over the room more heavily than anything I'd heard all week. Not someone believes it. Someone wants everyone else too. There was intention behind this. Direction. Purpose. Martha reached into her coat pocket. "I found this in my mailbox." She handed me a folded piece of paper. It wasn't signed. No return address. Just a single typed sentence. "Ask Evelyn why your father wrote 2 different letters before he died." Nothing else. No explanation, no accusation, just enough to plant suspicion. My heartbeat slowed instead of quickening. Fear makes people rush. Experience teaches you to become still. I turned the paper over. Blank. Cheap office stock, trimmed cleanly. Someone had taken the time to type this. Print it, fold it, deliver it by hand. That wasn't gossip anymore. That was a campaign. After Martha left, I carried the anonymous note upstairs. For the first time in 15 years, I unlocked the bottom drawer beneath the cedar cabinet. Inside lay only 3 things: Daniel's wedding ring, a small brass key, and an old leather journal. The journal wasn't mine. It had belonged to my father. I hadn't opened it since the week after his funeral. As I lifted it into my hands, something slipped from between its pages, a faded photograph. On the back, in my father's unmistakable handwriting, were 6 words. "Not everything begins where people think." I stared at those words for a long time, because suddenly I wasn't wondering who had started the rumor. I was wondering whether my father had known, decades ago, that someone would someday try to rewrite our family's history. And if he had, what else had he left for me to find? I did not sleep much that night, not because of the anonymous note, not because of the photograph, because of the journal. For 15 years it had remained exactly where I left it, wrapped in a faded brown cloth beneath the cedar cabinet. I had convinced myself there was nothing inside I hadn't already read. I was wrong. At 6 the next morning, with a cup of black coffee growing cold beside me, I opened it again. My father had never been a man of many words. His handwriting reflected that. Every page contained short entries, dates, names, observations, never opinions, never complaints. He believed facts should speak for themselves. November 8, 1981. Met with Harold, November 14. She still doesn't know. November 20. Perhaps she never should. No names beyond Harold, no explanation. Only fragments. I kept turning pages until one sentence stopped me completely. If the truth ever comes out, it must come from Evelyn. Not from Carol, not from the lawyer, not from the church. From me. I closed the journal and let those words settle. My father had made that decision decades before he died, which meant he had anticipated exactly what was happening now, not the rumor itself, the moment when the family would become ready to believe it. By Thanksgiving morning, the house was filled with familiar smells: turkey roasting, butter melting into cornbread stuffing, cinnamon from the apple pies. For years, those scents had meant safety. This year, they felt like scenery on a stage. People began arriving shortly after noon. Melissa hugged me politely without meeting my eyes. Ethan carried in 2 folding chairs but barely spoke. My cousin Janet smiled too brightly. Rebecca arrived last. Elegant camel-colored coat. Perfect hair, despite the November wind. Confident smile. She kissed my cheek as though nothing in the world had changed. "Happy Thanksgiving, Evelyn." "Happy Thanksgiving." Her eyes lingered on my face for just a second too long. She was measuring something. Whether I knew, whether I suspected, whether I would say anything, I smiled exactly as I always did. She looked almost disappointed. Dinner began peacefully enough. Football played softly from the living room television. Children laughed upstairs. Someone argued over whether the mashed potatoes needed more butter. Normal sounds, comforting sounds, until Melissa asked the question. "So?" She looked around the table. "Has anyone found Grandpa's second letter yet?" Silence. Not shocked silence. Expectant silence. People weren't surprised by the question. They'd been waiting for someone to ask it. Carol slowly lowered her fork. "There wasn't a second letter." Rebecca spoke before anyone else could. "That's not what I've heard." Her tone remained perfectly pleasant. "I've been told there were 2 versions." I looked at her. "By whom?" She smiled. "Oh, people talk." That answer told me more than any name could have. People talk, the safest hiding place in the world. For the next 20 minutes, the conversation drifted from recipes to football scores, but no one truly listened. Every glance eventually returned to me, waiting, watching, hoping I would deny it or confess. Rumors create an impossible choice. If you defend yourself too quickly, people think you're hiding something. If you stay silent, they assume the silence is proof. I chose neither. Instead, I watched Rebecca. Every time someone mentioned my father, she became just a little more alert. Every time the word letter surfaced, she stopped eating. She wasn't following the conversation, she was monitoring it. That was different. Dessert had just been served when my grandson Noah quietly slipped into the chair beside me. He leaned close enough that only I could hear him. "Grandma." "Yes?" I checked something. I turned toward him. "What did you check? You remember Professor Lewis, the genealogy researcher you introduced me to last year?" "I do." He helped me look through old probate filings online. My heart skipped once. There was only 1 letter filed with the estate. "I know, but—" He glanced toward the other end of the table where Rebecca was laughing at something Melissa had said. "Someone requested copies of Grandpa's probate records 3 months ago." I kept my expression calm. "Who?" "They wouldn't tell Professor Lewis." 3 months, not 30 years, not 10. 3 months. This rumor hadn't simply resurfaced. Someone had gone looking for my father's records before they ever started whispering. Someone had begun digging, deliberately, patiently. And for the first time since all of this began, I realized something that chilled me far more than the accusation itself. The person spreading the lie wasn't searching for the truth. They were searching for something they believed I still possessed, something hidden, something they had never been able to find. I looked across the table at Rebecca. She raised her glass toward me with a warm, effortless smile. And in that instant, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. She wasn't afraid of being caught. She was still convinced she was missing one final piece of the puzzle. That night, after everyone had gone home, I carried the dishes into the kitchen one plate at a time. The silence felt different now. Not empty. Waiting. Outside, the first snow of the season drifted across the porch light in slow white circles. Daniel used to love the first snowfall. He would stand at that very window and insist winter always made people tell the truth because there was nowhere left to hide. I wished he had been right. I had just dried the last serving bowl when someone knocked on my back door. 3 soft knocks. Not the front. The back. I already knew who it was. Rebecca stood on the porch without her coat buttoned, her cheeks pink from the cold. "I'm sorry to come so late. It's all right. It'll only take a minute." I stepped aside. She walked in, looking around the kitchen with the careful curiosity of someone entering a museum. "So much history in this house," she said. "There is. I imagine your father kept everything." "He did. And you?" "I learned from him." She smiled. "I thought you might." There it was. Not a conversation. A search. "I've been thinking about today," she said. "So have I. I hope Carol didn't upset you." "Carol isn't the one who concerns me." For the first time that evening, her smile weakened. "I don't know what you mean. I think you do." She folded her hands together. "I only repeated what people were already saying." "No," I spoke gently. "You improved it." She blinked. "The story." I poured 2 cups of coffee. "You didn't just repeat the rumor." I placed 1 cup in front of her. "You added the second letter." She looked down at the steam rising from the mug. "I heard there were 2. From whom? I can't remember." "I think you can." She didn't answer. Instead, her eyes drifted toward the hallway, toward the staircase, toward the second floor, toward the cedar cabinet she had never seen, or thought she had never seen. That's when everything finally made sense. She wasn't looking at my house. She was remembering it. 6 years earlier, after Daniel's funeral, dozens of relatives had filled every room. People carried flowers, folded chairs, casseroles, old photo albums. The house had never been left alone, not once, except for 23 minutes. I remembered because I had written it in my calendar. 23 minutes while I drove Carol back to her hotel after she'd become too overwhelmed to stay. Everyone else had already gone. Except Rebecca. She had insisted on remaining behind to straighten the kitchen. When I returned, everything looked exactly as I'd left it, or so I believed. Now I wondered, not whether she had stolen something, whether she had searched for something. "You've been upstairs before," I said quietly. She looked at me. "After Daniel's funeral. I helped clean." "Yes, nothing more. Just 1 word." Her fingers tightened around the coffee cup. "You've been carrying this around for years, haven't you?" she asked. "Carrying what?" "Whatever everyone thinks is hidden." I smiled faintly. "You're asking the wrong question." She frowned. "Then what's the right one?" I leaned forward. "The right question is why you believed there had to be something hidden in the first place." She stared at me. Neither of us spoke. Then, almost without realizing it, she whispered, "Because my mother said there always was." Her mother. Not Melissa, not Ethan, not Carol. Her mother. Rebecca wasn't the source. She was only the latest messenger. The rumor had existed long before she married into our family. It had simply been sleeping. Someone older had kept it alive all these years. Someone who had known my father. Someone who had been close enough to hear fragments of the truth, but never the truth itself. Rebecca suddenly looked frightened. "I wasn't trying to hurt anyone." "I believe you. She swallowed. "My mother always told me your father changed everything before he died." "He did." Her eyes widened. "So it's true?" "Not in the way she thinks." I stood and walked to the hallway. For a long moment I looked toward the staircase, then back at Rebecca. "For 34 years," I said, "I've protected the reputation of a man who asked me never to explain what he had done." I paused. "And next week, for the first time in my life, I'm going to break that promise." Rebecca's face lost every trace of color, because she suddenly realized the rumor she'd been spreading had never been about an inheritance. It had been circling a completely different secret all along, and she had just helped bring it to the surface. Rebecca left just before midnight. Neither of us had raised our voices. Neither of us had accused the other of anything. Yet, when the front door closed behind her, I knew the balance inside our family had shifted forever. She had come looking for answers. She had left carrying questions. Sometimes that is far heavier. The next morning, I drove to St. Matthew's Church before sunrise. The parking lot was empty except for Pastor William Harper's old pickup truck. He had buried both of my parents. He had married Noah's parents. He had known my family for over 40 years. When he opened the office door, he smiled kindly. "Evelyn, I need your help. I thought someday you might." That sentence made me stop. "You knew?" "I knew your father expected this day." He motioned for me to sit. Without another word, he unlocked a small filing cabinet behind his desk. From the bottom drawer, he removed a sealed envelope. Across the front, in my father's handwriting, were 5 words. "Only if Evelyn decides." Pastor Harper placed it gently on the desk. "I've never opened it." "You could have." "I gave your father my word." He looked at me quietly. "Now the choice belongs to you." For several moments, I simply stared at the envelope. My father had prepared for this more carefully than I had ever imagined. Not one safeguard. Several. He had never trusted that the truth would remain buried forever. He had trusted me to know when it shouldn't. I slipped the envelope into my handbag without opening it. "I think," I said softly, "it's finally time." Pastor Harper nodded. "The truth rarely arrives when people deserve it." He smiled sadly. "It usually arrives when someone innocent can no longer afford the lie." That was exactly it. Not revenge. Protection. I wasn't doing this for myself. I was doing it because Noah and eventually his children deserved a family history built on truth instead of whispers. When I arrived home, Carol was already waiting on my porch. She stood as soon as she saw my car. "I've been calling." "I know." She looked exhausted. "I need you to tell me something." "I will." "Today?" "Yes." Her shoulders relaxed for the first time all week. Inside, we sat at Daniel's old oak dining table, the same table where our father had once spread maps, photographs, tax papers, and birthday cards. Carol wrapped both hands around a mug of tea. "I don't care about money anymore," she whispered. "I never really did." "I know. I just need to know whether Dad lied to us." I looked at my little sister. For a moment, I didn't see the 70-year-old woman sitting across from me. I saw the frightened 12-year-old who used to hide behind me whenever thunderstorms shook the windows. "No," I answered. "He never lied." She blinked. "Then why has everyone believed this for so many years?" "Because I chose my words carefully. They only heard the ending of a story. And the beginning? The beginning belonged to someone else." She frowned. "I don't understand." "You will." After Carol left, I carried the green ribbon box to the dining table. Beside it, I placed 3 things: my father's journal, the sealed envelope from Pastor Harper, the unlabeled cream-colored envelope marked for Evelyn. 3 pieces of the same story, 3 decades apart. I finally opened the cream-colored envelope first. The paper inside had become brittle with age. I already remembered every sentence. Still, seeing my father's handwriting again tightened something inside my chest. "If you are reading this, then people have begun telling the wrong story. Do not defend me. Do not defend my reputation. Defend the people who would be harmed if my silence is mistaken for guilt." A tear landed on the page before I could wipe it away. Not because of what he wrote, because I finally understood why. My father had never been protecting himself. He had been protecting someone the family had never once suspected. And tomorrow evening, when everyone gathered again for the post-Thanksgiving supper at Carol's house, I would place every document on the table, not to expose the guilty, to free the innocent. The only question that remained was whether my family was ready to discover who that innocent person had been all along. Carol's house had always been where the family gathered for leftovers. It was an unspoken tradition. The formal Thanksgiving dinner happened at my place. The day after, everyone squeezed into Carol's dining room. Reheated turkey sandwiches filled the kitchen, and someone inevitably claimed the pumpkin pie tasted even better than it had the day before. That Friday evening looked exactly the same, until it didn't. I arrived carrying one leather satchel, nothing more. Inside it were the 3 documents that had quietly followed me through the last 34 years. The journal, the sealed envelope from Pastor Harper, the letter marked, "For Evelyn." I wasn't carrying weapons, I was carrying history. The room buzzed with conversation as I hung my coat by the door. Rebecca looked up first. The moment our eyes met, I saw she hadn't slept much either. She knew why I had come. She simply didn't know what I was about to do. Melissa smiled nervously. "Evelyn, can I get you some coffee?" "Thank you." Carol caught my eye from across the room. She gave a small nod. She was ready, or at least she believed she was. Dinner passed in polite conversation. Football, the weather, Noah's classes, Christmas plans. Everyone avoided the subject that had brought them there. Rumors behave strangely. People spread them eagerly. Then, when the person they've wounded walks into the room, they suddenly become fascinated by mashed potatoes. Finally, I folded my napkin and placed it beside my plate. "I think," I said calmly, "it's time we spoke about my father." The room fell silent. Not a fork moved. Not a chair scraped. Rebecca lowered her eyes. Carol folded her hands. Noah looked at me with quiet encouragement. I placed the leather satchel on the table. "I've heard many of you believe I changed one of Dad's letters." No one answered. "I didn't." Another pause. "I've also heard there were 2 letters." Rebecca slowly looked up. There weren't. I rested my hand on the journal. There was 1 letter, then on the sealed envelope, and 1 instruction, finally, on the cream-colored envelope, and 1 explanation that was never meant to defend my father. I looked around the table. It was meant to protect someone else. Carol spoke first. "Who?" I took a slow breath. "My mother." Confusion spread across nearly every face. "My mother?" Carol repeated. "Grandma?" Noah whispered. I nodded. "Your grandmother carried a burden that almost no one in this room ever knew existed." I opened my father's journal. 34 years ago, she asked Dad to keep a promise. Rebecca frowned. "What promise?" "That after she died—" I paused. No one would ever know she had secretly paid for this family's survival. No one moved. I continued quietly. "When Grandpa's hardware store failed in 1982, everyone believed he'd rebuilt it himself." I shook my head. "He didn't." I looked at Carol. "Mom sold the farmland she'd inherited from her parents." Carol stared at me. "No," she insisted, "the money be placed entirely in Dad's name." Why? Because she knew how proud he was. I could hear someone quietly crying. It wasn't Carol, it was Melissa. I unfolded the letter my father had left for me. His handwriting filled the page. I read only the passage that mattered. "Your mother saved every one of us. If people ever believe I earned everything alone, let them. She asked me for that gift. But if anyone accuses you of dishonesty because of my silence, tell the truth. Not for me. For her." When I finished reading, no one spoke. The silence felt completely different now. It wasn't suspicion, it was understanding. Carol covered her mouth with both hands. I never knew. You weren't supposed to. Why didn't she tell us? Because she believed love didn't keep score. Then I turned toward Rebecca. She looked devastated. I am so sorry. I know. My mother always said your father had changed the inheritance. He did. She looked confused. I smiled gently. He changed whose sacrifice history remembered. I placed a faded bank receipt beside the letter. The money was legally transferred into his account. Another document. The deed to the farmland. Another. My mother's signed authorization. None of it proved fraud. All of it proved love. And in that single moment, every whispered story about greed, forged letters, and stolen inheritances simply dissolved. Not because I argued louder, because the truth finally had documents of its own. No one reached for dessert. The pumpkin pie sat untouched in the middle of the table, its whipped cream slowly softening while my father's letter rested beside it. It struck me how strange families could be. For 3 days, everyone had been hungry for a rumor. Now they were sitting in front of the truth, and no one knew what to do with it. Carol was the first to move. She picked up the bank receipt with trembling hands and studied the faded ink. I remember Mom talking about that farm, she whispered. I thought she'd leased it. No, I said. She sold it 6 months before the hardware store reopened. Carol looked back at me. And Dad took the credit. He accepted it because she begged him to. Why? Because in 1982, a man losing his business in a town this small became the story. I smiled sadly. A wife quietly saving it never would have. Melissa wiped her eyes. I spent years thinking Grandpa built everything himself. So did almost everyone. Didn't Grandma deserve the credit? Perhaps. I folded my father's letter and slid it back into its envelope. But she never wanted applause. My mother had understood something I only learned much later. Recognition and peace are not always the same thing. She had chosen peace. The rest of us had mistaken that silence for absence. Rebecca finally stood. I owe you an apology. You don't owe me one. Her eyes filled with tears. I spread the story. You believed it. That's worse. No. I shook my head gently. Worse is inventing a lie after you know the truth. She lowered her head. My mother told me that your father cheated, Carol. I believe she truly thought that. Rebecca looked surprised. You do? I do. Rumors don't survive for decades because everyone is cruel. They survive because each generation inherits a story that already sounds complete. Few people stop to ask who wrote the first version. Rebecca reached into her handbag. I brought something. She unfolded a yellowed newspaper clipping. My mother kept this. Across the top was a photograph of my father standing proudly in front of the reopened hardware store. The headline read, Local Business Saved by Owner's Determination. I smiled softly. There it is. The lie? No. The beginning. She looked confused. That photograph became everyone's proof. I tapped the headline. People saw a proud man standing alone. Then I looked around the room. No one thought to ask who was standing just outside the frame. Noah quietly laughed through his tears. I think Grandma would have hated all this attention. She absolutely would have. The room shared a small, exhausted laugh. It was the first honest laugh we'd had all week. Not because everything had been repaired, because pretending had finally become unnecessary. Before anyone could speak again, I opened the final envelope from Pastor Harper, the one marked, Only if Evelyn decides. Inside was a single page, no secrets, no hidden confession, only my father's final instruction. If you have opened this, then you already know the right moment arrived. When they understand what your mother gave us, put these papers away again. Let them remember her generosity, not their own embarrassment. Families survive by truth, but they heal by mercy. I folded the page without reading another word aloud. That was enough. The rest belonged to me. Over the following months, something unexpected happened. No one argued about the inheritance again. Instead, the family began telling a different story. When the grandchildren asked how the hardware store survived the recession, they no longer answered, "Great-grandpa saved it." They smiled and said, "Your great-grandmother did." Rebecca visited more often than anyone, not out of guilt, out of gratitude. One afternoon, she admitted something that made us both laugh. "I spent 6 years looking for a second letter that never existed." There was never a second letter. She smiled. "No, there was only one family that forgot the first truth. I still keep the cedar cabinet upstairs. The green ribbon has become thinner with age. The envelopes have grown more fragile, but they no longer feel heavy. Sometimes Noah asks if he should digitize everything so future generations won't lose it. I always tell him yes. Records matter, not because paper is more important than people, because memory is fragile and whispers are patient. If no one protects the truth, gossip eventually begins wearing its clothes. I spent most of my life believing my job was preserving old documents. I understand now that it was something much quieter than that. I wasn't preserving paper. I was preserving the moment when my family finally chose truth over the story that had been easier to believe. And every Thanksgiving since then, before anyone touches the turkey, someone always says the same 6 words. "Tell us about Grandma's farm again." No one has mentioned a forged letter in years.